Okay, it's a fairly short account. Mark chapter 4, beginning at verse 35, this account of Jesus calming the storm. And here we'll read together. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him." Amen. I'm really drawn to the question that the disciples asked Jesus as he was sleeping. It's right there at the end of verse 38. "Teacher, don't you care?" The reason I'm so drawn to that question is I think that if there's anyone here who's had faith in God even for a little while, and then encountered what I'll call some form or another of the storms of life, there will be some moment or another where you will look up at the heavens and you will say to God, like, "Hello, don't you care? I thought I was one of your children. I thought you loved me." And yet, here I am in the midst of this struggle, whether it's a disease or an illness or a relationship problem or a finance problem or whatever it is, and you're just, if you've had faith for even a little while and then you find yourself in one of the midst of the storms of life, I think this question it's entirely practical. What's being taught here is entirely practical. Of course, the import, the lesson that we're going to learn is this: that Jesus is able to handle for us the storms of life. But in order to really dig into that, just a few opening thoughts. First, one of the things I want to tackle together, and I just want to think about this, is that this is a realistic, break into everyday life kind of power. Why do I say that? I say that because, you could have an approach to the Bible that says, boy, these are a lot of nice stories. They're kind of like legends. What a fantastic account of a person standing up and saying like, "Hey, wind and waves, be quiet." But you might not think that happened historically or that it actually happened. And as a result, it might be inspiring in the sense that, like, sometimes you read a good book and you're inspired by it and, you're able to lift your own spirit and face the next day because somehow something's been, cause to arise in you. But no. I want to say that what is recorded here is a real break into life kind of power that, this account actually happened here. I just want you to see something. I pointed out just relatively few verses, but I want you to see the number of details that are here and how specific the details are. So first of all, we get the time of day. It says that day when evening came. And you get this decision that Jesus says to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." But then there's this detail. If you look at verse 36, there's this phrase, "just as he was." So it says, leaving the crowd behind, they took him along. And it says, "just as he was in the boat." And if you first look at that and you've only read this passage, what does that mean? Just as he was. You actually would have to go back to the beginning of chapter 4 to realize what had happened was that day when Jesus was teaching, there was such a large crowd kind of pressing around him that in order to be able to address everyone adequately, he decided that he'd get in a boat and put out from shore. And so he actually was in this boat out a ways from shore, and the crowd was up on the shore, and that allowed everyone to see him. And by the time I get to this passage, apparently he's still in the boat. And what's being said here, and it's just a little detail. There's no purpose for it in the story other than that it happened. They left the crowd behind and they took him along just as he was in the boat, which meant he didn't first go back up on shore and gather anything, or he didn't go back up on shore and say goodbye to everyone. He was just in that boat, and then he's like, "All right, let's go." And they turned the boat the other way. There's another detail that's right beside that. It says that there were other boats with him also, right at the end of verse 36. And of course, to this story, if it was a legend or a myth or something that was, an inspirational fiction story, something made up, there'd be no reason to include a little detail that there was a few other boats who were making the journey with him. Then as this goes on, they could have just said that he was asleep for some time, but it tells that he was on a cushion, that he was, if you look at verse 38, he was in the stern. Those of you who are not boaters, the front of the boat's called the bow, and the back of the boat is the stern. So we're told a detail about what part of the boat Jesus was in, that he was on a cushion in the back of the boat. And anyway, here's the point I'm trying to make. If this was mythology, or if this was legend, or if this was some kind of not actual event, but supposed to be a spiritual truth, there'd be no need for all these details. Right. Why are the details there? The details are there because there were disciples who were watching, and they remember that this is what happened. That when evening came, Jesus was still there in the boat, but instead of going back up on the shore, he's like, hey, let's just go. And so they took off the other way, and there were some other boats that were there, and they kind of went with him. And then this furious storm came up that night, and Jesus, they remembered exactly where he was in the back of the boat on the cushion, sleeping in the midst of this whole thing. They remembered his words, what he said, how few there were, and how calm everything got. And here, this is a first-person memory told by someone who was there. And here's the reason I say this. If, as I think the purpose of this account is in Mark's gospel, to help us trust in Jesus in the storms of life, then it matters that this actually in real life happened as a historical event, because if it happened then if you're in the middle of a storm now, he can do the same thing for real in your life. Okay, so I just had to start by saying, hey, wait a second, don't take this as some kind of spiritualized fictional account that's supposed to be inspirational somehow. Take it for what it is. There was a man named Jesus who lived a couple thousand years ago, and he was in a boat as he was and pushed up. You see what I'm saying? This really happened. So that's the first thing. Second thing I want to say is not just that it's a real break into life kind of power, but I want to just help you see exactly what Mark is saying here, that the power that Jesus exhibited was, I'll just call it an infinite power. So a couple of details. First of all, this storm. So in verse 37, actually I think this is so great. It says, a furious squall came up. The actual Greek word for the word squall, I love this. It's good for us who are here in Florida because we have some experience with it. It's one of these words that's just as easily translated hurricane. This is a powerful, powerful hurricane kind of storm. Now, just so you know, the Sea of Galilee is unusual in this way, that it sits about 700 feet below sea level. And so just in the topography of Israel, the Sea of Galilee it's down, it's very low. Nearby, only 10 miles away, stands a tremendous mount, Mount Hermon, and it goes up nearly 10,000 feet above sea level. So the kind of just geography of the place is crazy, because you have this tremendous lowland and this tremendous highland right next to each other. And, people have written about this phenomenon and say, look, this is a place that is ripe for out-of-control hurricane, tornado, force storms that just suddenly come up when the cold air from the mountains meets the hot air coming up from the rift, and you get this tempest, this squall, this storm. It's unbelievable, and you get the sense that, here are seasoned sailors who at some point, they're convinced it's over. We're dying. Destruction is upon us. We can no longer navigate. The waves have crashed over the boat. You get the sense that this boat is now filled with water. They're just about to go under. It's just about to be lost when they finally turn to wake up Jesus. Anyway, If you've been in a hurricane, many of us have, you know like what the wind feels like. If you've been out the ocean or some other body of water when storms come up, you know what that looks like. And there's two surprising things, astonishing things that happen in this passage. First, the way Jesus addresses the storm. The disciples show up, they say, "Don't you care?" And he wakes up, and it says he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, it's just two words in Greek. Be quiet. Here in the NIV it says, be still. This is so astonishing. Jesus actually talks to the winds and wave like it's a parent to a little child. Hey, be quiet and stay quiet. Those of us who have had little kids, eventually we sort of reached our limit, and the kids are running around, and we're like, that's it! And we just be quiet and stay quiet. And Jesus, to me, this is fascinating. He doesn't stand up and roll up his sleeves. He doesn't step back and make a grand show. He doesn't pull out a magic wand. He doesn't call upon the name of, in the name of, he just like, hey, quiet and stay quiet. Who talks to weather like that? So that's the first astonishing thing, the way that Jesus addresses the wind and the waves. And then the second astonishing thing is what happens next. Quiet. Especially for those of us who are just thinking about our kids. Hey, be quiet and stay quiet. Nothing happens here. Boom. And, first of all, it's interesting here. It says, then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Which, if you just read over that quickly, you think it's like redundant, but no, it's not. Listen, any of us could go outside when it's windy and shout at the wind, and maybe by pure coincidence, at that moment, the wind stops. But you know how waves work. In fact, this is so interesting to me. Verse 37, a furious squall came up. Actually, the original Greek, the word for squall, like I told you, is a word that could be translated hurricane. But it literally says a great, in fact, the Greek word is mega. A mega hurricane came up. And then here, it says the wind died down and it was completely calm. The word for calm is there, and it's a mega calm. I think what Mark is saying in everyday English is it was dead calm. Anyone ever been on the ocean when it's just like dead calm? Just like glass. One moment ago, hurricane. Anyone might go outside and say to the wind, be quiet, and just coincidentally, the wind may stop. But you know that if you're out on the ocean and the wind stops for a second, the waves keep, especially if the whole sea's been churned up, it could be hours or even days before you get back to dead calm. And here, Jesus, be quiet, stay quiet. Not only did the wind stop, but then dead calm. Dead calm. And what I'm really drawn to here at the end, the disciples were clearly afraid as the boat was about to go under, and they go to Jesus, say, don't you care? They're afraid out of their mind. But if you look at the very last verse, it says they were terrified afterwards. It was one thing, they were scared out of their mind, but then when it was all said and done and the wind stopped blowing and it was dead calm, that's when the real fear set in, and they start asking, who is this that even the winds and waves obey him? This passage is teaching us we can trust Jesus in the midst of the storm. Maybe this will help, maybe it won't. This is a way of getting into it. Some of you, maybe, when you were in college, you had an American literature class. You came across short stories by Flannery O'Connor. There's a great one called A Good Man is Hard to Find. I don't know how many of you can remember reading that at one point or another. If you get inspired afterward and you say, I'm going to go read that. It's only 13 pages long, very easy to get to. I'll warn you ahead of time, it's not real inspirational reading. It's dark, it's gruesome, but there's these two characters, and the point that she makes, I think, just so brilliant. So the two characters are a grandmother and then a misfit. And the misfit's a terrible criminal, a murderer, a thief, that's who he is. Anyway, here's the story. This grandmother is, actually, I guess for us it's interesting, along with her family, or her son and daughter-in-law and 3 grandkids are taking a trip to Florida. And they're on their way to Florida, driving through the state of Georgia. And this grandmother, as the character gets developed, she is, she fashions herself as kind of a Southern lady. She's polite. She knows how to act in high society. She thinks of herself, in sort of high terms. And, she's distressed because her kids, but then especially her grandkids, just don't seem to fit in with the conventions that she's so familiar with. And, one of her kind of complaints is that, this next generation just doesn't know how to treat people. And, it's influence, at one point she says, it's the influence of Europe on American culture. And, she's just complaining because her grandkids just don't seem to understand her conventions of politeness and courtesy. And also, as this, as the story goes on, you just see that although she has sort of this sense of politeness and courtesy and sort of just at least a scratch of morality, really, she's never stopped to examine life. She's religious, but she's never really thought about what it means. And so she's a very shallow character. And what Flannery O'Connor does is she forces this grandmother character to all of a sudden face the stark realities of life. As they're going on, they decide she lies to her son to get him to go to this place she wants to see. And as they're on this dirt road, she had smuggled the cat in the car, and the cat all of a sudden jumps out and lands on his shoulders, and he jerks the wheel, and they go over a ditch and roll the car once. And, everybody survives that accident, but they're stuck. And then they wait, and finally this car arrives, and it's the misfit who's in the car, who's been in the news, so she recognizes him. And he's got 2 companions along, and they're just delighted because they think to themselves, okay, perfect. We've been looking for another car. And they see an opportunity that it might take a little bit to fix, but this will work just fine. And it soon becomes apparent to the grandmother that she and her family are going to be murdered. And again, this isn't the kind of reading you want to go away and, if you want to have a light, airy Sunday, I wouldn't recommend it. But first, they take the father and son away into the woods and shoot and kill them. And then they take the daughter and the daughter-in-law and the 2 children, the 2 remaining children, into the woods and kill them. And it's just the grandmother left. And the whole time these murders are happening, the misfit is saying a lot of interesting things to the grandmother, who all of a sudden is getting out of her kind of shallow existence and facing the cold, hard realities of life. Anyway, kind of toward the climactic point of this short story, the misfit basically says, Jesus is gone and messed everything up. And anyway, here's his backstory. And this just comes out as you read the short story, that at some point or another, he grew up with maybe a little bit of a tough upbringing. He was one of these kids who wouldn't just accept life the way it was and always had to find out why. He got himself into a little bit of trouble. He can't even remember what the first trouble was, but he got thrown into prison. And while he was there being punished, he came to resent that punishment because he felt that the punishment exceeded whatever the original crime was he's now forgotten. In other words, he was so mistreated, so humiliated, so degraded, so punished, that he's come to just say to himself, there can't be a God. And there can't be justice in the world. There's only punishment, and if I made it out, then it's just for a little bit more, and I better just live the way I want to live until the rest of the punishment comes. Anyway, why am I bringing up this whole short story? I think if you were to read it, this would be kind of the point from the point of view of the misfit, that life is a storm. This is his viewpoint. That the storm is ultimate. In other words, if you just look at life and our existence, if you look out at this world we live in, this stark universe we find ourselves in, there are these brute and chaotic forces of nature. And we can't control them. And listen, you may be eluding it for now, but it will get you. I mean, if it's not a hurricane, then it'll be cancer. And if it's not cancer, it'll be a car accident. If it's not a car accident, eventually you'll have heart disease or diabetes or something. I mean, you may outrun it for some time, but it's going to catch up, it's going to punish you, and finally it will get you. And for that reason, life, from his point of view, is meaningless, it's cruel, it's intolerable, and amoral. So from his point of view, the best thing you can do is just enjoy what you can while you can. And what's particularly interesting about this story, and Flannery O'Connor is just a genius, because her short story, I think, is just a reflection on the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. And I don't know if you've ever read the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. It's just a fascinating book. I wouldn't have known that something like this would even be in the Bible. But there's an entire book in the Bible that I'll call it this way. It's a thought experiment. The wisest man who ever lived, King Solomon, one day or over the course of some time decided to conduct a thought experiment. And the thought experiment was this: what if there was no God? There's this phrase in the book of Ecclesiastes, under the sun. And he says, what if all there was not a spiritual world, but just this physical world, what you find under the sun, there was no God, and he just decides to start playing this out. Okay, what if there is no God? And I'll just, over on this screen, let's just walk through that book a little bit, because I think it's helpful to do this thought experiment. So the book begins this way: the words of the teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, and he says, meaningless. Meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And he says, what do people gain from all their labors at which they toil? And there's the phrase, under the sun. Especially today in our contemporary world, fantastic thought experiment. Why? Because if you go to a public high school, you're going to find out that in their biology class or in every other class, what's basically being taught to all their kids, and by the way, it's just in our culture as well, is that there is no supernatural world. There's just this natural world. And, in biology class, what they're going to teach you is what is the mechanism that makes this natural world work? Death. Chance. Red tooth, tail, and claw, right? Just red tooth, nail, and claw. The strong eat the weak. Everyone's going to die. And, that's the way through which this life is just moving on. And anyway, what I mean to say is that if you're not conducting this thought experiment, our culture is conducting a thought experiment. What if there is no God? And Solomon, who's the wisest man who ever lived, said, well, man, if there's no God, then everything that's happening in this world is just completely meaningless. It's just completely meaningless. Like in verse 3, he starts talking about work. A lot of people find meaning in their work. And he says, look, if there's no God, you can't find any meaning in your work. I'll give you a few verses just from the book. He says this in Ecclesiastes 10. He says, look, I've observed this. If a man is lazy, the rafters sag. If his hands are idle, the house leaks. What's he saying? He's saying your lack of work and your laziness could bring on tremendous suffering. If you're going through a storm of life, it could be because you haven't worked. But then in another part of the book, this is just the same chapter, in fact, he says this: whoever digs a pit may fall into it. Whoever breaks through a wall may be bitten by a snake. Whoever quarries stones may be injured by them. Whoever splits logs may be endangered by them. What's he saying? He's saying, but if you do work, if you do labor, then what could happen to you? Tremendous harm, tremendous suffering. In fact, your work could even kill you or injure or maim you. And so whether you work or you don't work, his conclusion is there's no God. It doesn't matter. It's meaningless. In fact, he goes on, he says, I've seen something else under the sun. There's that phrase, under the sun. He says, the race is not to the swift or the battle to the strong. Nor does food come to the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, or favor to the learned, but time and chance happen to them all. Because I've seen this. If there's no God, then it's all unfair. They apply themselves, they try to learn about it, they gain wisdom, they gain skill, and they remain poor. Where there's some other person over here who just lucks into it, and that guy's rich and enjoying everything. He's like, man, it's all meaningless. And how many of us, feel that way? I think we have to. That's with regard to work. Here, all things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What's he saying? He's like, look, in this life, no matter what happens, no matter what you gain, you can't get content. Our desires are bigger than stuff. I'm sure you know this. Probably in your life, either you know someone who's become very wealthy, and yet, even though they have everything that you would think a person could want, what's the deal with us? Contentment eludes us. And if there's no God, then what are all these desires that we have that are bigger than this world can somehow fill? He says, whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. This too, he says, is meaningless. As goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit are they to the owner, except to feast his eyes on them? In other words, you get a new car. Oh man, is it? Yes, I love this new car, but 6 months later, oh, the smell's gone. I don't know why. I thought it was going to fix all my problems, but it hasn't. I got to get more, but the more you get, the more you need, and it's just this cycle, and it's all meaningless. What about relationships? Maybe that's, if there's no God, we can find meaning there. Here's what he says. He says, no one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. So what's he saying? He's saying, look, every day you get up, you labor, you toil, you sweat, you worry, you stress out, you're going through everything. And you know what? No matter whether you put in a lot of effort or no effort, it won't matter that much to your grandchildren. To them maybe. But what about their children? You'll be lucky if their children remember your name. And what about their children? They won't even know you existed. I was thinking about this in my office. My great-great-grandfather, my grandfather's grandfather, had a Bible and set of commentaries, which I have in my office. What do I know about him? I know his name is Herman, and I know that I have his Bibles and commentaries in my office. What was his life like? What was he concerned about? I don't have the first idea. And he lived the same kind of life that I live. And so we think to ourselves if there's no God, certainly what I'm doing every single day, it must matter. And it's like Solomon's like, are you kidding? How will it matter? Just 100 years from now, it won't even matter to anyone that you were alive or didn't live, that you did stuff or didn't do stuff. And at the end of the day, if there's no God, if nature is all there is, then finally, the sun's going to burn out, everyone will be gone, and, since this universe is billions and billions of years old, it won't have mattered at all, this one little slice in time, that any of us existed or anything we did, whether we were good to each other or bad to each other, whether we lived good lives or poor lives. Who are you kidding? That's the thought experiment that Solomon just carries out. And now this. Moreover, no one knows when their hour will come. As fish are caught in a cruel net, or birds are taken in a snare, so people are trapped by evil times that fall unexpectedly upon them. We all sort of know in the back of our mind, it's not that real, that eventually the storm is going to swamp us. We try to just put it out of mind. We try not to think. But now, in Flannery O'Connor's short story, all of a sudden, the misfit has showed up. He's got a gun in her chest. And she's like this bird caught in a snare. And that's how it's going to be with all of us. Anyway, here's what the book of Ecclesiastes is trying to tell us. If you really take the time to think about it, if there's no God, then what are you left like? And here's what Ecclesiastes 2, 3, and 5 says. I mean, this is repeated. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toilsome labor under the sun for the few days of life that has been given to them, which in Flannery O'Connor's short story is the Misfits Creed. He basically says, look, I know I'm going to get swamped. I know I'm going to finally, the storm of life's going to get me too. Punishment's going to come again. But in the meantime, I want your car. And I might as well get what I can while I can until it's my turn to be swamped as well. Because I want what I want, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. There is this line, you know, the grandmother and the misfit are talking to each other, and the grandmother, you know, is very shallow. She's like, but you could pray to Jesus. And this is what he says, and I think he's right. The misfit says, Jesus thrown everything off balance. If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw away everything and follow him. And if he didn't, then it's nothing for you to do but enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can by killing somebody or burning down his house or doing some other meanness to him. So, actually, it's fascinating because the misfit knows more about life than the grandmother does. He sat in that prison cell and he thought it all the way through. He says, look, if Jesus raises people from the dead, then yeah, you can't do anything. You've got to stop what you're doing. You've got to turn your life upside down for him. You've got to give him everything because he's Lord. But if he didn't, then, look, this world is meaningless. It's cruel. It's amoral. You better just live for yourself. If you want something, get it because your turn's next. And this misfit decided while he was sitting in that jail cell, Jesus isn't real. And as a result, he's living out this life. Anyway, now here, back to this story. What is the story saying? It's saying there is a power above the storm. Be quiet, stay quiet, and everything's still. And so here, there's a power above the storm. It's not all meaningless. If this story is right, and there's a power above the storm, then there's love, and there's beauty, and there's life. And I think what the misfit said is exactly right. There's only really these two choices. Either there is a God or there's not a God. Either Jesus is Lord or he's not Lord. And if he's Lord of the storm, then it deserves the ultimate response. I mean, as the misfit puts it, if he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw away everything and follow him. And that's that. Which is why the book of Ecclesiastes and lots of parts of the Bible say this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. In fact, this is Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13. When Solomon's done with this thought experiment, he says, okay, now all's been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And that's the story. They're on the boat, the waves and the wind are breaking over it. They're totally afraid. They wake Jesus up. Be quiet, be still. And there's calm, and then they're more afraid. Why? Because there's a power above the power of the storm. And let me tell you something. I think that makes all the difference. In fact, I'll call this the ultimate life hack. Here, look. What's this passage really about? Or what's it saying? It's saying this. At the end of the day, you've got to read the account that was written by these eyewitnesses, and you have to decide, is it true that there's a power above the storm and Jesus is Lord of all? Or is there no God? And are the biology teachers at the local high school correct? And, is the misfit right? I mean, it's one or the other. But if you believe that Jesus, listen, one more thing, I just have to say this. I believe that Jesus is saying here that we can trust him in the storm. And I believe that the way Mark wrote this actually helps us to see exactly why we can trust him in the storm. I mean, our question is this: don't you care? Now, and I don't want anyone to miss this point, here's what I think is totally fascinating. Mark has written these short verses in such a way that if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you cannot miss that this is almost a thought-for-thought retelling of the story of the book of Jonah. You remember the book of Jonah? There's this prophet. God said, go to Nineveh. He didn't want to. So you remember what he did? He went down to the coast. He got on a boat. They got out on the open seas. Remember this? A storm rose, not just any storm, a great storm rose. All the sailors were totally afraid. They start chucking things off the boat. They don't want themselves to sink. Finally, they go and find Jonah. You remember what he's doing? He's in the back of the boat, what? Asleep. They wake him up. Don't you care if we drown? And then, of course, what ends up happening is that Jonah becomes the means through which, what happens to the storm? He's thrown overboard, and then what? The wind stops, the waves are calm, and you remember what happened next? The sailors were more afraid. So, look, I mean, you can't miss it. Every detail, the exact same thing. A boat, seas, storms, main character sleeping. At the end, the winds and waves stop. Terrible fear takes over everyone. It's exactly the same, minus this one tiny detail. Remember what Jonah said? How do the winds and waves, how are they going to stop? You had to throw me in, right? If I die, you'll live. That's what he said. So pick me up off the boat and throw me in. So only that one little detail. Just a little different. Or is it? I don't think so. You know, if you read all of Mark's gospel, you know, one of the things that comes out in the gospel is Jesus says, look, there's something you ought to know. One greater than Jonah is here. And what happens to Jesus? Finally, he descends into suffering. He's, if I can put it this way, thrown into the storm. He dies, we live. And I think Mark's just trying to say this. And listen, that the Lord of the storm, the one who could stand up to the winds and waves and have the authority and the power to say, be quiet and stay quiet, and then astonishingly, quiet. The one who has the authority to do that descended into suffering and redeemed it and used that suffering for the grandest purpose of all, the saving of many lives so that we could be forgiven and set free and reconnected to God. And here, this is why I'm saying it. Here's what we think. I know we think it. I think it. Okay, Jesus, you're Lord of my life. Now that you're with me, no more storms, right? Right? But what's Jesus saying? Hey, I have enough authority that I can save you from all storms, but I also have enough authority that I can take you through them safely. I'll just call this the great life hack. You know, in fact, Jesus, he gets up. This is verse 40. He says to his disciples, why are you so afraid? He says, where's your faith? And I love that question. You know, here in the NIV, do you still have no faith? Where's your faith? What's Jesus saying? I think he's saying this. He's saying, look, if you know me, I've given you more than enough evidence for you to see that I am Lord over the storm. I've given you enough evidence to say that the storm is not the ultimate thing. I am. What does that mean? It means that any of us who may be in the most tremendous storm right now, we may feel that the water's come on so much that we're about to capsize. And I know I've been there. I know you've been there. And some of us are probably there right now on the edge of capsizing. We think we're going down. And, you know, the disciples go and wake him. And they say, don't you care? And he's not like, oh, I can see where you're coming from. He's like, hey, where is your faith? And I think many of us, it's like we've been rocking Jesus, shaking our fist at heaven maybe. Say, don't you care? Don't you see? Look, if he's in the boat with you, There is no storm over which Jesus does not have the authority to say, be quiet and stay quiet.
Amen.
And it's not just that he's going to deliver us out of all storms, he's going to deliver us through them. And I think that for every person here, we've been given more than enough evidence to know who he is and what he's done, what he's capable of, what his powers are, to know that no matter what I'm going through right now, no matter how terrible it is, I have enough evidence to see that I have nothing to be afraid of. He's going to carry me through. And to me, this is the ultimate life hack. I mean, what a lesson. Because, if that's not true, then we're all doomed.
Yes.
But if it is true, then everything changes. And so this was one of those sermons that we had to do quite a bit of thinking about. And I hope it's one of these that you'll just keep on thinking about. And their final question, who is this? Is what we finally have to ground down into our hearts. Is this just a man? Was this just a legendary story for our inspiration to help us have a little comfort just for the moment? Though at the end of the day, the sun's going to stop shining and nothing good is ever going to, is it meaningless? Or is Jesus Lord of the storm? And if he's Lord of the storm, I think that changes everything. So let's pray together.
Thanks so much for viewing this sermon. I hope you enjoyed it. For more content like this, please subscribe below, and I'll see you next time.